Dialga Arceus is the breakout deck of the weekend. Leafeon EX shows up as Celebi EX's new most powerful partner. An 18 trainer Articuno is one of our top performers as well. Let's go ahead and dive on into our first meta report of the Triumphant Light expansion in Pokemon Pocket. Looking at our largest tournament of the weekend, we had the following starting metagame distribution. Dialga Arceus decks represented 11.5% of the starting field. Darkrai Magnezone All-Star from last season was 9.5%. Leafeon EX paired with Celebi EX was 9%. Executor EX with Celebi EX from last season was 7%. Charizard EX from the game's inception was still 6%, and 18 trainer Articuno had a whopping 4% starting field as our sixth most popular deck. In my opinion, the best way to measure the strength of these decks is to look at their representation among the most successful from this same tournament. We had 223 players that had a 60% or higher win rate after 10 rounds of Swiss gameplay. Looking at the makeup of decks inside of these top performers, we see Dialga Arceus as 26.5%. We see Darkrai Magnezone as 10.5%. We see Leafeon Celebi as 11.5%. Executor Celebi at 3.5%. Charizard EX at 4.5%, and 18 trainer Articuno at a whopping 7%. To concisely summarize the differences between these two charts and measure the strength of these decks, we would say that Dialga Arceus increased its starting metagame share to among the top performers by 130%. 18 trainer Articuno was the second best performing, increasing its meta share by 75%. Leafeon Celebi increased by 28%. Darkrai Magnezone increased by 11%. And Executor Celebi and Charizard both decreased in their share between the starting distribution and top performing decks, meaning they both underperformed in this first big tournament. Let's take a look at a Dialga Arceus deck list and talk through some of the details and variation we see from list to list. Most of these deck lists are playing 6 basics, with 3 of the most successful having 9 wins after the 10 rounds of Swiss, featuring copies of Shaman as their additional basic Pokemon past Dialga and Arceus. Notably, this sample list that I have on your screen is playing one of each Shaman, one that can heal, and one that reduces your retreat cost by 1. Because it has Shaman as a tool to make your retreat costs cheaper, it's choosing to drop the 2 copies of Leaf we've often seen in these Dialga deck lists in the past in order to play other utility cards such as Adaman, Cyrus, Giovanni, and even a copy of Mars. It's worth noting one of the 3 players with 9 wins was playing 2 copies of the Healing Shaman, and they were still leveraging 2 copies of Leaf to have increased mobility. Past these 3 at the very top, there were players playing lots of other variations as well, with stuff like Mew popping up and even Yanmega and Probopass in some situations finding success as well. Looking at the matchup table for Dialga Arceus, it's easy to see why it had such a strong performance this weekend. It is almost 60% favored against Leafeon Celebi and Darkrai Magnezone, the second and third most popular decks in this tournament, and it is a whopping 75% favored against the Executor Celebi deck that was top dog from the previous format. Against the other 2 decks in 5th and 6th place popularity, it is slightly ahead against the Articuno EX18 trainer deck, and it is about dead even against Charizard EX, even without playing copies of Mew generally. Moving along to Leafeon EX Celebi EX, the air quotes new archetype that was the second most popular this weekend. We can see I use those air quotes because this core is the exact same template that the Executor EX Celebi EX deck used in the previous metagame to a dominating fashion, only instead of the egg, we have our newest evolution. I think it's easy to see the appeal of this lead Pokemon here. It does more consistent damage, always 70 as opposed to coin flipping for 40 to 80, and more importantly, the Pokemon power on Leafeon means that while you are getting your early beatdowns on, you get to power up your Celebi EX in the backline, almost having this split role of lead Pokemon plus superior like we saw in the early bad Celebi decks 2 seasons ago that can make your Celebi an absolute monster when it finally comes up to the front of the line. This build still using just that 3 basic template with Pokemon communication to hit that Leafeon more consistently, and playing a plethora of healing cards, 2 Ericas, 2 potions, and a giant cape in the mix to keep your characters alive as long as possible and mitigate the typical downside that we see with these low basic count decks. Looking at the matchup spread for the Leafeon Celebi deck, as mentioned a moment ago, it is not favored against the Dialga Arceus deck, but against all the other decks that were popular enough to make it onto our pie chart this week, it has a relatively even matchup. The most notable of these even matchups is the fact that playing Leafeon here as opposed to Exeggutor makes this archetype competitive into Charizard, which had previously dominated the Exeggutor matchup in our previous metagame. I think this matchup being close to even as opposed to strongly favored for Charizard is a big part of why we saw that deck have such a poor performance this weekend. While 18 trainer decks are nothing new to Pokemon Pocket, the Articuno variations having such a strong performance in this large tournament is something that we have not seen in the past. It definitely feels like every time we get new good utility trainers added to the game, this archetype gets closer and closer to being on top, and it's very possible that the addition of Irida as a powerful new water supporter could be the thing that fully pushes it over that mark. In addition to Irida, we see Potion as well as Giant Cape fitting a similar mold to what we see with the Grass Celebi 3 basic decks to allow Articuno to have plenty of time to build up organically in the games where Misty doesn't flip a bunch of heads for you and win the game on the spot. There's some variation in the supporting trainers we see this archetype playing because there's so many good ones to consider in today's metagame. In our sample list, I would say Giovanni, Blue, and the third Pokemon tool are the ones we see flexed into other utility cards most often. At any rate, we're definitely a far cry from playing Pokedex and Handscope like these archetypes had to do when Pokemon Pocket first launched, with such an abundance of good support cards being available now with this time's expansion. Looking at the matchup table for the 18 trainer Articuno deck, I'll be curious to see if this cheesy archetype is able to maintain a strong performance in future events. It's notably even or a bit unfavored against the 3 most popular decks, Dialga Arceus, Leafeon Celebi, and Darkrai Magnezone, with its strong performance largely coming on the back of beating the everything else category of the tournament, as well as having a strong matchup against both Exeggutor Celebi and Charizard Moltres. The other 3 most popular decks are all variations of things from last season: Darkrai Magnezone, Celebi Exeggutor, and Charizard EX Moltres. While their details can vary a little bit different from player to player, by and large, none of these archetypes were leveraging anything meaningful or new from the Triumphant Light expansion. Before we close things out today, I'd like to highlight a handful of off-meta deck lists that had tournament success this weekend that I think are interesting options for attacking the metagame we saw develop to start. We begin with a Rampardos Lucario Pseudo Wudo deck that had a 9-1 record on our largest tournament. I think Pseudo Wudo in particular is a really interesting piece of tech for attacking the Dialga decks, as well as Leafeon, and of course the 18 trainer Articuno decks that are all EX Pokemon. When we pair this up with Lucario, you get to hit for a whopping 70 points of damage for just 1 energy, and when they eventually dispatch your efficient attacker, you typically have another one lined up or a Rampardos rearing and ready to go to crack for 130 or even 150 in one blow. Next up, we have an Arceus EX deck featuring Crobat as well as Heatran. I'd featured a build of this the first day the expansion released, and it was awesome to see it find success in not just 1, but 2 different players' hands in the largest tournament the first weekend. Notable that this deck list only plays Fire Energy because the Golbat and Zubat that you're leveraging attack with colorless, giving you flexibility to have Heatran attack consistently, and then when you eventually evolve into Crobat as the stage 2, you have that free retreat, letting you pull it back to the bench, either move in Arceus to start cutting your opponent down or smashing with Heatran. This deck even gets to leverage 1 copy of Dawn to be able to finesse the energy around that it invested in Golbat or Heatran early to get Arceus attacking a turn sooner. Looking at the matchups the 2 successful players with this deck faced, they bested Dialga Arceus every single time they ran into it. If you didn't see this deck in action, I'll go ahead and link my highlight in the video description down below. The final piece of tech I wanted to highlight that warms my monkey-loving heart is that Infernape, Heatran, Arceus put up a couple of strong finishes in our tournament this weekend as well. While it didn't have a massive sample size to make the pie chart, it was played by a handful of people, and in the 12 matches this archetype played against Dialga Arceus, it won 8 of them, or 66% of the time. Heatran in particular seems like a card that could potentially solve some of the problems Infernape has had. It is a beefy 1 knockout point Pokemon that you can lead on to give you time to build up your stage 2 in the back. You can put energy on it to start attacking with early while you do that, and then Arceus giving it a free retreat cost means you can store an energy on it to dawn back up to Infernape later so it can attack twice. While our matchup data for a smaller sample deck like this isn't always a ton to go on, it does imply that your grass matchup is good as expected. You're running down Charizard more often than not, but you're likely a little bit behind in the Darkrai Magnezone matchup. If you're looking for more sweet off-meta decks with some competitive success behind them, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because tomorrow morning's video will be covering all of the deck lists I've scoured from Pokemon Pocket's various smaller community tournaments that went on this past weekend that look like they could have promise in letting you attack what we have going on in this metagame. Speaking of, what do you think of how things are shaping up so far? Personally, I don't think it's too terribly surprising that Arceus being the face of our new pack is powerful and competitive, but I was honestly a little bit surprised that the Executor EX deck from the previous season fell as flat on its face as it did. The strong performance of the 18 trainer Articuno cheese deck is perhaps a little bit worrying, but looking at its matchup table overall, I think there's perhaps a chance that that sorts itself organically as the metagame develops more. What would you like to see happen as we move forward, or where do you think we're going to head in the future? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed my breakdown and data-driven wrap-up today, be sure to smash that like button as well. I appreciate everyone that made it all the way through to the end of this video, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.